Next one.
Very odd because it's the most regressive.
It's unbelievable.
It's a really strange position to be a progressive who's reinforcing the ideologies of a regressive culture that's very ancient.
But what's incredible is that they'll come up with ways to defend this cognitive inconsistency, and hence that's part of the ostrich parasitic syndrome that I was mentioning earlier.
What are some ways that they defend it?
So, example, let me just give you a few manifestations of ostrich logic. My friend Muhammad is a very nice guy, and he drinks and he fornicates and he's very liberal. So the idea then becomes that as long as I can identify a single exemplar of a Islamic person who does not otherwise adhere to what Islam dictates, then it's not true that Islam is bad. Now, this is a manifestation of a more general cognitive bias.
Your feedback on this?
So I would say that
what's he saying? Well, you sum it up for the average layman. They're like, they can't maybe make out what we're trying to deduce from here.
Right.
What is in layman's terms? What message are we getting from this?
What he's trying to say that anything in his opinion which complies with his definition of progression is good. Islam does not comply with that. Therefore, Islam is bad. That's his deduction, right?
He's saying that Islam is regressive.
Regressive.
That means it's in the Stone Age.
Yes, in the Stone Age, it's a medieval religion.
Yeah.
Right. So he's saying he makes this point quite often. Actually, he says it's very archaic, very medieval, very ancient religion. This, by the way, in logic is called the genetic fallacy. Genetic fallacy is basically to say, and this is it's a textbook informal fallacy. It's one of the first things anyone will learn if they've studied the basics of logic. Now, he makes this point over and over again that this is an ancient religion, a very old religion, or whatever. I mean, so what? Does that take away, depreciate from its truth value? Because actually, democracy is more aged than Islam. Islam with the big I, which we would say that the coming of the Prophet Muhammad sallallahu alaihi wasallam. Democracy was exercised in the ancient Greek period of time. So this was a good maybe 1,000 years before Islam, or something actually more than that. So we're talking about if that was the logic, you're a liberal Democrat with small L and small D, right? You believe in liberalism and you believe in democracy. Yet liberalism, or you can say democracy for sure, is an ancient belief. And he makes this point once again. So does that make democracy a unuseful way of life? So once again, the genetic fallacy is it doesn't actually yield any positive results. The second thing is, here, he's allowed for his, basically I would say the ruler, by which and through which he measures truth, the post-enlightenment age, which is basically after there was a philosophical age in the 17 to let's say 1900s, whereby some philosophers came and they preached certain philosophies of them. Liberalism was refined. Lots of republicanism was defined, refined. Lots of popular philosophies were kind of refined at that period of time. And he thinks the judge of a good society is that which is complicit with those particular philosophies. My question would be, what's the proof for that? What's the evidence for that? So you've taken for granted that the Enlightenment age is the be-all and end-all, is the pinnacle of human achievement, is the philosophical peak. Now, what is the objective, in an objective way? So what is your way of dealing with that? What is your evidence base for that? How can you provide evidence for that? In fact, if you look at the Enlightenment period, most of the philosophers actually disagreed with each other on very core tenets. And that's why you had that conglomerate of different philosophers always disagreeing with each other on core issues. Thus, your measure of truth is really a subjective measure of truth, which relies only upon, I would say, the post-colonial white man's world. And this is very much the way that the colonialist, the British colonialist, the French colonialist, you can say the Italian colonialist, the German colonialist, all of these European colonialists, the Dutch colonialists, they actually justified colonizing lands. And that's how America was actually, in a sense, formed. So if that is the case, my question to you very directly, Joe, would be, how can you prove it? How can you prove your implicit assumption here that progression is that which goes towards Western civilization or its understanding of enlightenment, etc.? How can you prove that? Because we can't just take those premises for granted.
Don't we see people judging like Islam and the civilization of Islam based on two countries, specifically, you have Afghanistan and Iraq, which have been like blown back into the Stone Age.
Right.
So they look at those places where they've been just bombed, and the people who are living peacefully, right, and now minding their own business.
Yeah.
Now we went over there, just turned everything into. How many people died over there? Innocent people.
In Iraq, some of the statistics say 123,000, 125,000 people died. Some say it goes up from the ranging statistics. Some say 125,000 goes up to 1 million. So there are ranging statistics, but that's a massive number.
Massive, yeah.
That's a massive number which cannot be compared to anything, and we're not justifying by anything that the terrorists have done. So those terrorists, the Islamic terrorists, what they have done in terms of human casualty doesn't compare to what just that one particular war.
So you blew up burned the books in the libraries. Everything was just destroyed. And the country's upside down.
Absolutely.
So people think, okay, well, this is Islam. They're backward. But
Right.
I mean, are there some modern days examples of some countries that Muslims are living in? I mean, what examples do you give? You got Dubai. What do you?
Well, I would say
Malaysia. Where would you give examples?
That's a good question. So I would say, generally speaking, I wouldn't premise this by saying that the measure of an advanced society is necessarily developmental or economic, right? But even if we did look at economic, even if we did take that as a kind of measure, there are some cities and some countries now in the Muslim world, like in Malaysia, like in Indonesia, like in Turkey, like in different countries, like you say UAE. These are countries which are growing at a rapid rate. However, who cares? It doesn't do anything to prove, reduce, increase the truth value of Islam or any other religion. Look at where America was a good 100 years ago. There was the Wall Street crash in the Great Depression. This was literally 100 years ago. I mean, we're talking about the 1920s and 30s, the Wall Street crash in the Great Depression. Does that mean that the values that you take so much for granted were false then and they're true now? Does economic growth and sustainability necessitate truth? I think this is actually something that a lot of people do believe. That if the values of a particular country are good, then the economics will be good. And that's something he said in another segment or one of his guests today. It's a very false kind of fallacious type logic. China should be at the forefront of our analysis then. Whatever they believe, it must be the truth. Because according to many different economists, they're saying that China will actually overtake America in its overall GDP and will overtake it even militarily in 100 years or 50 years.
One more point. What about when Islam was at its, what they call, golden age?
Yeah.
When you look at Islam was now in Spain and places like this,
Right.
How advanced, they say progressive, was it regressive back then, or
That's
was
a really
the rest
good
of
question.
the rest of the world where people were
Absolutely.
in the dark ages? What
Yeah.
happened if you use this example?
Well,
Does that fit?
that's a really good question, because I would argue that if you look at, for example, the time period of about 410 AD to 1485 AD, this is what is commonly referred to as the Middle Ages. Yeah, the Middle Ages is also referred to, ironically, as the European Dark Ages, and the reason why they call it that is literally because the Europeans didn't have at that particular time much of a cultural, economic, or philosophical contribution on the world. And in fact, the superpowers of the world were not the Western world. After 1485, there was a massive shift because basically the Europeans found the Americas. And that was the age of the discovery. And the Renaissance also started, the early modern period started. There's lots of different things that started at the same time. But if you think about the period of time that I've just mentioned, the Abbasid Empire, for example, was seen as the strongest human empire in the world. And so if we use the same logic, we have to look at the historical timeline. One of his arguments, or one of the arguments that his panelists oftentimes make, is that economic growth is a measure of truth. Well, if that's the case, we have to look at all of the time, and this is a false premise anyways, but look at all the time. And the Quran actually informs us of the fact that there will be days and there will be times where non-Muslims will be successful, whether it be militarily or economically, and Muslims will be successful economically and militarily. In his Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, when he says, وَتِلْكَ الْأَيَّامُ نُدَاوِلُهَا بَيْنَ النَّاسِ, these are the days which we alternate between the people.
Yes.
So in other words, there will be some days which you'll be prosperous and victorious, and other days which you will not be prosperous and victorious.
Yeah. All right, let's go to the next one.